Welcome to the Point Loma Church podcast. This is episode 2 of our new series to complement our Sunday sermon teaching. We're doing a series called Earthwise, God's Call to Care for Creation. And we are inviting professionals from our community to share from their experience and explore how environmental stewardship is an act of justice, discipleship, and hope in Christ. And today we have Chase Mahan. Am I saying that correctly? Okay, whew! Chase Mahan, and he is, well, we're gonna tell people what you do. So you are an archeologist. Now, when I think of archaeology, I think of like Raiders of the Lost Ark and digging up dinosaurs. But what is it at its core?
It's a great question. When I used to teach, and I was an adjunct professor for about 6 years, every class when I taught archaeology, I would first day within the first 3 minutes, I'm like, who can tell me what archaeology is? Or I'd be like, who here is here because they want to learn about dinosaurs? And almost the entire hand goes up. And I'm like, you guys are all wrong. We're not going to talk about dinosaurs. That's not what archaeology is. Archaeology studies the human past, right? So the study of archaeology is the study of the human past, and to do that, we study material culture or artifacts, right? And we find artifacts in a number of contexts, which could be, of course, in the most famous, which is excavations, right? Revealing the earth to find artifacts, buried over time, or of course the surface manifestations of those. And the most obvious ones being this architecture that's found across the world, which is Machu Picchu, the pyramids of Giza, all those things, Roman architecture. That is archaeology. And also archaeology has access to not just the written record, which is the purview of history, but prehistory, or, to use that nomenclature, which takes us back to the beginning of humans. So it's wonderful, great to be juxtapositioned to study that in full breadth of history. But if we don't have access to that written history, we study those, the things that are left behind. And it's probably not hard to imagine all the things we leave behind daily. And so think about that for specific cultures and things that are unique to specific cultures and the things that are left behind over a person's lifetime, which is a lot. And so, yeah, in terms of archaeology, we study human past and we study the things that are left behind.
So it sounds like you have a close relationship with the earth, so to speak. I mean, obviously your workplace is the ground. And so in this Earthwise series, that's really what we want to kind of get to. And so I think one of the big questions is can archaeology, can it tell us how we have cared for the environment in the past? And if so, how has our care for creation or cared for the environment, how has it evolved or devolved? What would be your opinion on that or your thoughts on that?
I think to answer that question, whether we have cared for the planet or these environments is can we actually see it in the archaeological record? And I can make a few arguments for that. One, every culture has done it differently and different time periods over time, depending on, and a number of things can impact that. First of all, can we find evidence that humans have impacted the environment over time? Yes, we have. We can see that, and the number of sites that are left behind. And you may not notice, but there's millions of archaeological sites across the United States. There are hundreds of thousands of archaeological sites just in San Diego County alone. These are, of course, we protect that information and the location information for obvious reasons to help preserve those sites. But they are across the country, and oftentimes we don't know what to look for. So just the presence of people on a landscape can give us information. Population growth and decreasing or increasing over time. Maybe that is impacted by changing environment, or maybe that's impacted by a new population coming into an area, like the time of contact when Spanish colonization happened to indigenous California. There was a huge change of population during that time. There are so many instances across the world of us trying to provide for people, provide for our neighbors, and also provide for the environment, knowing that this is our only place that we get.
Right.
Now, if you're asking in terms of our care culture, right, the evolution of that, that has been integrated into all of our beliefs, societal beliefs, and systematically has been integrated in many different places, but has changed over time as societies change.
and last week we had talked about with Ryan Waterman, we had talked about global warming and or climate change. That climate change is real, and so when we think about the increase in the global temperature as one of those outputs of that, how has the increase of the global temperature impacted the preservation of artifacts? I mean, I just imagine that artifacts do they disintegrate quicker? Are they harder to find? Do they when you do find them, do they kind of fall apart because they haven't been buried deep for many?
This is one of my favorite questions. I think one of the most common questions I get asked as an archaeologist is how do you know where to look? How do you know where to look? Right. And you usually find sites a number of ways, which is you find them accidentally. Some farmers hey, there's a bone sticking out of my road cut or out of my ditch, and it's been there, and they call a university or they call the state or the local sheriff. So we find them accidentally. Mm-hmm. You may find them systematically, right? So for my job, I work for a cultural resource management firm, which makes sure that land developers are in compliance with the federal, state, and local laws that protect cultural heritage.
Okay.
And so you may be required based on a development, whether it's building a new house or maybe it's a roadway or a pipeline, to do a systematic cultural resource survey. And so you may set up a grid line and find archaeological sites that way. And of course, you can use geospatial technologies, ground penetrating radar to find things under the surface as well, or even drone imagery. You may have seen those nice, wonderful maps across the Amazon revealing lost cities. That's a thing. And we do that often.
Interesting.
But as far as how these sites get preserved, you usually get sites preserved because they get rapidly, at least preserved in the ground, they are rapidly buried.
Okay. Floods or...
Yeah, exactly. So a flood brings sediments and then buries it, and it's automatically locked from sunlight and it's locked from air, which are sunlight and air, and usually dampness or wet things that are not consistent will immediately destroy really any organic material and or non-organic. But yeah, you want those places that are dark and secluded and they just, that kind of get preserved. But we hardly find any organic materials in archaeological past, and we have actual rates for how that happened. Regardless, the sort of issue of a warming planet has greatly affected the preservation of sites, and in California especially. Think about where we live right now in San Diego, why we live here. It's because it's sunny, we have the beach nearby, we have agricultural resources where there's juxtaposition between the desert and this maritime Mediterranean environment, and it's a wonderful place to be. It was also a wonderful place to be 5,000 years ago. And for much of the same reasons, the maritime resources were abundant, plentiful all the time. And not just in the maritime, you also had the agricultural resources as well. Now, a lot of those sites and village sites were set up like we are. Think about Sunset Cliffs in San Diego County, right? Those houses right on the cliffs. That coastline was not the original coastline. And there are sites that are now underwater. And there are maps. You can go and look these up that are maintained by the Smithsonian about how these sites are now underwater archaeological sites.
Interesting. Okay.
And so just on the basis of rising sea levels in general, right, we see things are constantly buried. And think about especially places down there in the south, right, there's a huge influx of these coastal sites that are being buried. Some of the oldest sites, and it makes sense, you would have some of the earliest sites to be on the furthest extents or exteriors of the coastlines, are the Channel Islands up north near Santa Barbara area, right? Some of the oldest sites in North America are on the Channel Islands that are now underwater. And the same thing could be said for much of the northern coast, all the way down to South America, along those coastlines. So just in this simple way that sites are buried underwater right now, and we can see that in a number of ways, which we can discuss, but they were there and now they are not.
Interesting. Wow. So when people talk about the environment, I've heard in my past, right? When people are oh, global warming, this was when I was young and global warming was just kind of coming onto the scene as a topic of conversation. And I remember, some people being oh, we got to pay attention to this. And then there was some segment of people that would be oh, calm down. That's just kind of like the cycle of the earth and how, sometimes it's warm, sometimes it's cold, sometimes it's warm, it just kind of cycles. And, I just wonder, as someone whose workspace is the land, what is your perspective on this? Did you feel like it is different now, or are we just kind of in a warm cycle? And so everybody can kind of calm down about global warming. Does that make sense? What's your perspective?
I would say it is in fact changing, and it is in fact different, and I justify that based on time scale. If you want to think about over someone's lifetime of, let's say, on average, 80 years, over an 80-year lifespan, you're going to experience some fluctuations and returning to norms, and maybe a spike and maybe a dip. But if you take that in the aggregate of thousands of years, which pertains to archaeological record, this is a different time. I specialize in late Pleistocene archaeology, hunter-gatherers. So there's late Pleistocene and the beginning of the Holocene is this transition from the Ice Age sort of environment to what you might maybe see nowadays, which is a huge change. So we're talking about the actual extreme of climate change, and then into this sort of like wetter, warmer environment. And over that time, there's maybe been some big dips, right? Maybe the mid-Holocene warming period, and maybe a return to some Ice Age conditions, maybe around 7,000 years ago. But regardless, and you take that in the aggregate, this is an incredibly different time based on the presence of where humans can live, right? And certain times during that period, people weren't living in certain places where they are now. And certain places are inhospitable to people versus others. So we can see that in the radiocarbon dates and the existence of human presence across the planet has changed. And we also see the way we are reacting to a changing climate completely different than before. And so again, it's all based on your perspective. And geologists are shaking their heads at us because they're in a different time scale altogether. But we're talking about like the actual the timeline of humans on this planet, which is just so small comparatively to to a lot of things. But if you're talking about the scale of archaeology and humans in general, 100%, climate change has affected not just the preservation but also where humans can live, the resources we can eat, and how sustainable it is to live. And of course, that affects culture. Right. And when things, when you can affect all of the things that we consume and subsist on, it changes our needs and can changes our beliefs as well. And I think that's what you're seeing right now is like a change of belief in systems and, a reorganization of priorities based on this changing climate.
In 1,000 years, what is this testimony? What two people sitting, archaeologists, what are they going to say how we cared for our planet, and is there going to be an artifact that's going to say how well or how poorly we cared for our planet? You know what I'm saying? Like, what would be the dig that 1,000 years from now? What would they find?
What a hard question.
I know. Yeah, I know that was a curve. That's a curveball. As you're talking, I'm like, I want to know in 1,000 years, what are they going to say about this?
It's funny. I asked my students of this, but I never asked myself to finish this assignment. And I'll tell you what my students always say. They're always like, they'll pull out their iPhone. They're like, this is. Right now, if they're talking about like the epoch of the early 2000s, like it's a cell phone or computers, technology, right? This interface at the beginning of computers is undoubtedly a marker of this time, right? And it is, it's absolutely changed the face of the planet. And that technology has bred ideas and other technologies for the betterment or worse for the planet. Right. But if you're talking about the physical manifestation, what's going to preserve in the record? Those little computers in your hand are going to preserve, right? The things that don't preserve really well are those organic materials, right? Wood, bone, leaves, things like that. But we see mostly like those really old stuff, 2,000 years ago. The things that preserve are Roman architecture made out of stone. Right. Pompeii, when you have this really flash-fired vent, or you have stone tools. Right. And those things preserve really well because they're non-organic.
It'll be interesting to see what does our phones tell future generations about how we cared for the planet.
probably will have something completely wrong. But if the digital era actually does preserve history as well as we think it will, which is we are now phasing out the use of physical documents, right? If the digital age does preserve well, maybe we'll know exactly what it is. We maybe not know the minds and maybe the fear and the wonderment we see right now. That may change. I will tell you, archaeologists, we get it wrong all the time. And mostly, like, we don't understand something, we pretty much put a stamp on it called that's culture and that's different, or that's ritual, and we just don't understand it because it's culturally specific. But I also wouldn't ever make any universal claims about humans in general, right? I think every country and people and neighborhood, think about the places you grew up, how different that cultural fabric or those sports teams, you know, there's so much identity built up into communities. Right. And think about the Christian community as well. Think about the way we characterize ourselves. So like the physical remnants, I don't think we'll be able to get at some of those things what actually might be lost. And I think that's something that archaeologists are always concerned about, that we are missing, is because we recognize that does that phone that might preserve, does that represent Christians, or does that represent these people, or does it just represent the technology of the time? So we have to be aware of those things. Hopefully these oral histories and stories and that get preserved, because those are the things that like get at agency and minds and thoughts and processes, opinions, generational history. So yeah, in 2,000 years, they're going to find our phones. They're going to see some of our buildings, but they may not actually get at maybe who we are as a people. And I think it's our, I think it's a shame. And I think that's why I think all of us are really invested in our, these cultural stories, family histories.
Is there something that we can do to make sure that
keep talking to your
their
kids?
Story is,
keep talking to your kids. I mean, some cultures do it better than others.
Make sure that story gets passed on correctly.
Talk to your grandfather, your grandmother, talk to your grandchildren, talk to your kids. Keep telling those stories. That's the only way these things get preserved. That like, you want to understand the minds of people and that get passed on. Keep telling those stories. And if an indigenous history has taught us anything from across the world, is that the way we get at these things is we keep telling stories, write it down. Yeah, maybe keep your journals. But you have to be able to have someone invested in that, which is why you tell it to your kin. Right. Tell it to your people.
Man, and then it makes you think about evangelism and like...
Think about the Bible.
And thinking about, and even like evangelism done, I don't want to say right, but you know what I'm saying, where it feels like it's done well and I don't know, at the heart of what God wanted. So, but...
We have to keep talking about it, think about God and the stories we tell of the Bible. That's how we keep that spirit alive and keep those truths consistent. You keep telling these stories.
Okay, so Chase, has there ever been a dig that you've been on where you found something or something was revealed that you just kind of, were awestruck and just kind of struck by the... who God was and the image of God, because that's what we're talking about, this idea of like divinely designed, image of God, that you kind of saw something and you were amazed by God, or it like made you see God in a new and a profound way?
I think that is a wonderful question. I mean, I'm amazed and thankful, that's first and foremost, for all those opportunities. I find myself in a pretty, I feel just so grateful for the opportunity to be able to study our past and be able to travel and do those things. But I have one instance that comes to mind, and maybe one other, but I remember being on a dig in Mongolia. And I was out of Mongolia for about 7 weeks. I was hired to lead an excavation. It's a Bronze Age excavation, which means in Mongolia there's a time of Genghis Khan or Chinggis Khan, and they had a huge aspirations for finding, anything that was related to that dynasty. But what we actually ended up digging was the normal people. The normal people, quote unquote, right? We were actually digging these households out there, and we were about 20 kilometers just south of the Russian border. We're up against the taiga in the middle of nowhere. It took me 3 days in a cramped van to get out to this area, and I'm out there with Mongolian students, and I don't speak Mongolian. I think I left there with about like 70 words and maybe like 12 phrases I can say, and but enough to like teach them how to do precision excavation. I knew some things about the cultural history, not so much, like I'm not Mongolian, so I don't claim to know that, but I learned a lot. And so that's where I'm going. This was, I remember I we set up this grid. We're opening this up. We don't know what we're going to find, but we've done some GPR, some ground penetrating radar. We knew there might be some sort of structures down there. And nearby, we have these dino-explorers, which are these like monumental markers that tell people from far away, yep, you are where you are. And they can see these large stone features. And they're dotted across this mountainous landscape. Imagine being out there in a high steppe, grasslands everywhere, and these large rising mountains, low-lying clouds going in beneath them, cattle and goats and camels grazing in the distance, rivers going through from Lake Baikal, Lake Baikal feeding these rivers, and they're freezing rivers, but it's gorgeous. And you, of course, have people on horseback tending to these sheep and these goats and these cattle. And then I'm excavating this household, and this is the Bronze Age, so this is anywhere about 500 years AD, and so quite old. But I'm uncovering these things, and the things we're finding, and we're excavating these tiny little squares with trowels and brushes and you name it. And I've got about 5 students that are excavating with me, and I'm teaching them, and we just get started, and we start unveiling bones after bones after bones. And then we unveil this little structure, like we found this house floor with like a bark mat. We find post holes where they actually, you can see where they that held up that roof. And we see also other material culture. We find little hearths, right, where they were cooking things. Beneath all of that, we also see, of course, like sacrifices. We see these like little burials that are usually placed in this Mongolian culture when they would settle. And this is just like one single family household, It doesn't cost as much as San Diego these days, much cheaper, but it takes a lot to get there, right? But and I remember like, all right, I'm pulling apart these bones, and I'm trying to identify what they are. I'm teaching my students, acting like they don't already know. And they're like, and again, I don't speak a lot of Mongolian, but they're like, oh, this is what this is. This is what this is. And I realized they've been living, and again, Mongolia is an incredibly rural place, except for a few hot pockets of civilization, hot pockets of industrialization there, and the rest is quite dispersed. But regardless, these students have grown up interacting with the world different than the United States. And they're like, oh yeah, this is a sheep, this is a femur, this is this. And they knew exactly also how to interpret this. This is from the Bronze Age. And they knew exactly what that burial meant. They knew what that bark mat meant. They knew all these things and how that might, play into their, interpretation of their existence today. And I just was, I remember, I didn't have a lot of communication, but I remember calling on a satellite phone and my mom a few weeks later after that. And I was like, they teach me things every day, not just the language, which I was terrible at, but also they teach me that they are far more connected. And I, obviously looking at a landscape, incredibly overwhelmed by God's creation. I'm overwhelmed by the kindness of the people. They placed this huge opportunity in front of me to lead this excavation, to be taught by these kids. And these kids, they're in their teens, late teens, early 20s, and with immense respect and care, allowing me to also help care for their material culture as an outsider, to do so. And I don't say that as like, the classic American experience of like just being outside. I was there to help them teach excavation. They're in charge of the interpretation, but their connection to their cultural heritage, their family history, and what that means, whether it's their diets or whether that's the history at the time, they knew it. And I'm not convinced that that I really understood that, that I really carried that with me in those lessons. So I was overwhelmed by the opportunity. I was overwhelmed by the fact that like how deep in time our history and where we come from, these animal husbandry sort of Bronze Age houses, which we were all living roughly the same at the time of the Bronze Age. And having that deep appreciation for how far we've come, and the fact that I was born at this time and I have the opportunity to reveal that history and to have the things that I have was also, of course, a huge blessing. So absolutely overwhelmed. And I'll say one more thing, other time that, of course, and I'm always just overwhelmed with the opportunities, but I think when I was when I teach, I'm always trying to emphasize, if I can teach anything to people about cultures, it is this cultural understanding and sensitivity. And it's mostly to do with like, all cultures are weird. How cool is that? That God made us so different. And I think that's the coolest thing in the world.
Totally.
So when I'm teaching, at every end of, I also have taught culture anthropology. And when I teach that class every year, and I'm like, God is so good. When students can recognize, like, not only like, oh yeah, they're weird. I'm like, that is weird and that is cool, and that also creates sensitivity and understanding. And that also makes me happy. I'm like, that's love. I mean, if you can learn to like recognize, oh yeah, that's not scary, that's not different and othering. It's like, oh, God is so cool. Those people are God's children and they are just wonderful. It works for them. They're not mean people. They're, they just recognize they do things differently. And I think that is wonderful. Those are God's people, and that gives me a sense of wonderment and appreciation for what God can do. And I think if we can lead with like, yeah, this is all God's creation, it creates love and endearment and sensitivity. And that also, I think, creates a better caring for the world, not just for God's people, but also for how people decide to help care for the world. So
yeah, I hear the words connection and unique in there, and it feels like that's the Bible, right? We are unique and we need to be connected, right? And I just, because these people were deeply connected to their culture, and they're, and then they're weird, and that's like, yes, we all are.
You kidding me? They made fun of me every single day,
Totally,
every single day.
All right, last question. I got to ask one more. So, being in archaeology, are you being in the field and what you do? Would you say you're more or less concerned for the future of our planet?
Am I concerned? I don't know. I think I am at times encouraged about some of the things I talked about, which is if we are in this precipice of change, right? Maybe it's the Anthropocene, right? This changing epoch of time, this huge explosion of technology, and maybe a global society, right? Things are getting more and more integrated. If archaeology has taught me anything, and I think I already mentioned this, is humans return to this behavior of coming together and being more community-based, and helping your neighbor and being more egalitarian. We return to those things because we are stronger as a community and as a society. And again, those may not be always clean transitions and things, but and when I take the aggregate of history together, those communities and those places that have persisted or have persisted through whether it's environmental change or political change, social change, those societies that are able to band together and help your neighbor, the ones that survive or persist. And so if I take that, and if I want to take the optimistic perspective, I'm thinking, I'm hoping that, and I see it right now, and I think many of us do it. And I think as Christians, we can hope for that, and we see it as, I feel encouraged in a lot of ways. It doesn't mean I'm not concerned, and I'm not saying what's happening, but I'm hoping that if history repeats itself, hopefully it means that we are all going to return to being community-based and helping each other.
Well, Chase, thanks for joining us this week, and thank you guys for joining us, and we hope to see you next week with whoever we talk to, but hope this continues the conversation in your life, and make sure you share this podcast with a friend, and then you guys talk about it, and how can we live our lives differently to make a greater impact on the world and for the future of our planet. Thanks for joining us. Talk to you later. Bye.